I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. We've spent the last few weeks discussing a lot of, seemingly disconnected aspects of Nauvoo Mormonism. We hit on criminality and how it was enforced or was covered up. We discussed the rising tensions between Carthage and Nauvoo, touched on the overwhelming financial trouble plaguing the empire, introduced Joe's military aspirations in hoping to align his Nauvoo Legion with other independent militias, and then we parsed the confusion rising from competitors for religious succession rights, and we met two of the largest enemies of the Holy King, a Brutus and a Judas, in inner circles, and then we've also stood dumbstruck by the chaos caused by polygamy and the tension of keeping it under wraps while still practicing it among initiates. While each of these topics has been separated topically throughout our chronology, what I'm getting at is this was a very chaotic time in Mormon history when we take it all together. There's this common misconception that all of these pressures and factors built up for 14 years under Joseph Smith's leadership, and when he died, somehow all of it ended. But that wasn't the case. Joe's death this upcoming June of 1844 wasn't a crescendo. It was a vantage point from which to view the true insanity of the future of Mormonism in all its forms. Mormonism, out from under the leadership of the almighty Joseph Smith, it split, it evolved, adapted, mutated, and it grew in multiple directions under the leadership of different competing dudes, all claiming to be the rightful next guy. The death of Joseph Smith marked the end of one era, which gave birth to dozens of eras in the immediate future after his assassination. After his death, it was a matter of switching from chaos to pandemonium, if that were somehow possible. That sense of confusion is really hard to communicate, not only to you listeners, but to readers of the original records, as historians in yours truly do constantly. How could they communicate this confusion? How could people living in 1844 tell us, actually illustrate to us just how crazy it was to live at the time of these monumental historical events? You know, I was struck by something I was reading this week on the Joseph Smith Papers website. I was looking into the various First Vision accounts to brush up a bit. I was reading their historical introduction, which is featured on the most of the documents that are hosted on the Joseph Smith Papers. Now, these historical introductions, they're useful to a certain extent, but only one sentence that I read here caused me to have a sense of wonder about what we find in the historical record that really illustrates my point and what I'm kind of digressing about here. It says, quote, "It's not clear why Joseph Smith ended his earliest history before completing his stated intentions. Some of his other documentary endeavors, including the journal he began the same year, are similarly incomplete, perhaps indicating that other activities simply took precedence." End quote. You know, people often say that the revolution won't be televised. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, and maybe it already is. Iran, France, Argentina, Hong Kong, Crimean Peninsula, take your pick. There's plenty of these things to choose from. But that phrase, the revolution won't be televised, can mean many things, but I interpret it to mean that everybody is going to be too occupied with what's going on to spend any time documenting what's happening. Maybe that's true, but with everybody having a camera in their pockets and access to nearly unlimited print in the form of digital paper, that seems highly unlikely. However, the same wasn't true of the 1840s. When life was too crazy for people to sit down and write what happened, nobody 175 years in the future would ever know that it did indeed happen. Historians are confined by historical models that documents can substantiate. But what about that which was never documented to begin with? Now, we have a lot of documents to work with early Mormon history, but singular documents only provide one small snapshot of a much larger tapestry. Like using a laser pointer for a flashlight, each document in and of itself doesn't offer much, but when viewed in the greater context of related documents, we begin to construct models from familiar patterns and learn what we can by filling in holes with reasonable speculation. patterns. One of the most human traits that we have is recognizing patterns, even if those patterns aren't really there. Patterns help us feel safe because we know what's next. When something doesn't fit into a pattern, we have to seek for some way to explain or to understand the anomaly and thereby form new models to comprehend these new patterns we observe. What am I on about here? What am I talking about here? This may be an unconventional opener to an episode, but I'm kind of meandering around to the point that patterns can fill in blanks and teach us things we otherwise would never be able to understand. Understanding history is a matter of finding patterns and doing our best to make our patterns liquid enough to adapt to new information when it is discovered. Every time you think that you may understand something about history, a new discovery is made and patterns or models have to evolve and adapt to incorporate that new information. Now, I like how Laurel Thatcher Ulrich approaches history. Her ability to meld material and documentary history stands out as a masterclass of how to understand history and treat relics of a bygone time. This is from the introduction to her newest book, A House Full of Females. Quote, "On a winter day in 1857, a 50-year-old Mormon apostle named Wilford Woodruff visited the 14th Ward Meeting House in Salt Lake City. In his diary, he noted, the house was full of females, quilting, sewing, etc. Wilford had 3 wives and was about to acquire a 4th. His own house was full of females. But this gathering was different. Sometimes as many as 50 women assembled for meetings in the Ward Relief Society. His first wife, Phoebe, was its president. Remarkably, one of the quilts its members were making has recently been found. Completed in the autumn of 1857, it was later sold at a raffle. The man who won cut it down the middle years later and gave 1/2 to each of his own 2 grown daughters. They and their heirs passed it on, until no one was quite sure where their own piece came from and what had happened to the other. Brought together in 2004, the 2 halves, only slightly damaged by time, reveal the signatures in ink and in thread of the 67 women who made it. Phoebe's autograph appears on 1/2, her appliqued fruit and flowers on the other. The sundering and reuniting of the quilt offer a metaphor for the losses and recoveries that characterize women's history. This book is a kind of quilt, an attempt to find an underlying unity in a collection of fragments." End quote. Now, this book by Ulrich is remarkable, and we're going to be relying on it for much of the future of the podcast, particularly in Utah polygamy history. But Ulrich really gets to the heart of my point, albeit her focus is women's history. And, honestly, few people have done as much to advance Mormon women's studies than Ulrich and Claudia Bushman's Holy Order of fellow female historians. But an attempt to find an underlying unity in a collection of fragments. We seek patterns by which to understand history. Eliza R. Snow was a pattern seeker and maker. She understood the patterns by which the world operates and created her own patterns to better understand the patterns of human nature. And Eliza Snow is an interesting person in many ways. She was the single most powerful woman of Utah Mormonism and arguably the only woman that Bloody Brigham Young would ever take advice from directly. In Nauvoo, however, she was still seeking her place in Mormon leadership under the watchful eye of her friend-turned-enemy, Emma Smith. They were close friends, but being sister wives had degraded their friendship. Emma's opposition to Eliza and Joe's relationship pushed Emma to the outs, while Eliza remained closely knit with her fellow sister wives and the ever-expanding ring of Nauvoo polygamy. Eliza operated on a different level than most. She saw the ugliness of the world as much as the beauty of it. She was also super into exploration of mental creative spaces, possibly aided by some of the herbalism that she picked up from her friends and her family. But her patterns are quite interesting for what they reveal about her and about the world that she saw around her, as much as her perspective of that world. One of her earliest patterns is titled Mental Gas, which was composed in March of 1826 at the age of 22, and this was composed literally at the same time that Joseph Smith was arrested for disturbing the peace and bilking Josiah Stowell out of treasure digging money. Quote, "Charles to his teacher, Sir, you say, that nature's law admits decay, that changes never cease, and yet you say no void or space, 'tis only change of shape or place, no loss and no increase. That space or ignorance, Sir, explain, when solid sense forsakes the brain. Pray, what supplies its place? Oh, sir, I think I see it now. When substance fails, you will allow. Air occupies the space. Not so, my child, that rule must fail. For my philosophic scale, the substitute for sense is not so dense as common air, nor by the consummate care the chemic skill can dense. But when misfortune turns the screw, 'tis oft compressed from outward view. By outward force confined, but with expansive power 'twill rise, destroy the man, increase the size, and swell his optic blind, of various hues, yet still the same. Though human gas, 'tis chemic name. Some poets call it pride. The important aid this gas imparts among the various human arts can never be denied. This gas entire may be obtained from skulls whence sense is mostly drained, or never had supplies. But were the noblest heads disclosed from acts and motives decomposed, this human gas would rise. The parson's lecture, lawyer's plea, devoted sums to charity. The sage with book profound, the muse's pen, the churchman's creed, the millboy on his pacing steed, are more or less compound. But he who struts in fiction's dress and boasts his ill-deserved success in wooing some fair lass who uses this perfidious art to gain an unsuspecting heart is late discovered gas. Eliza, in many ways, could see the strings that tug and pull at reality. And her next poem offers a bit of political commentary on John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in the wake of their nationally felt deaths. Eliza, in many ways, was a patriot through and through, but she also decried the atrocities America was committing against the indigenous people, with her poem by the title of The Red Man of the West. The Great Spirit, 'tis said, to our forefathers gave all the lands twixt the eastern and western big wave. And the Indian was happy, he'd nothing to fear, as he ranged o'er the mountains in chase of the deer. And he felt like a prince as he steered the canoe, or explored the lone wild with his hatchet and bow. Quenched his thirst at the streamlet, or simply he fed. The heavens were his curtain, the hillock his bed. Say then, was he homeless? No, his heart was beat for the dear ones he loved in the wigwam retreat. But a wreck of the white man came over the wave. In the chains of the tyrant he learned to enslave. Emerging from bondage and pale with distress, he fled from oppression, he came to oppress. Yes, such was the white man invested with power. When almost devoured, he'd turn and devour. He seized our possessions, and fattening with pride, he thirsted for glory, but freedom, he cried. Our fathers were brave, they contended a while, then left the invader and coveted soil. The spoiler pursued them, our fathers went on, and their children are now at the low-setting sun. The white man, yet prouder, would grasp all the shore. He smuggled and purchased and coveted more. The pampered blue eagle is stretching its crest beside the great waters that circle the west. Behind the west wood where the Indian retires, the white man is building his opposite fires. To fell the last forest and burn up the wild, which nature designed for her wandering child. Chased into environs and nowhere to fly, too weak to contend and unwilling to die. Oh, where will a place for the Indian be found? Shall he take to the skies or retreat underground? Another pattern that Eliza devised around this same time is titled The Preacher's Exploit, wherein she talks about an ambitious young preacher riding his mule through a mire, unable to unbind himself from the mule and wishing that he had remained sleeping under Pluto's shade. But short his triumph, for, amazed he found, his mule was sinking deep in miry ground. Beneath their weight the humid earth gives way, around their heads the watery reptiles play. The sluggish mule begins a brutish moan, his noise commingles with the preacher's groan, who, wearied with his subterranean ride, would gladly walk, but his feet are tied. All o'er disdained he gasps for every breath, and seemed expiring in the jaws of death. Well, luckily for this exploitative preacher, an angel touched him, removing the clay from his eyes, and untied his feet from the mule. Obsequious Saturn heard the plaintive cry, rolled on his wheel, and crushed the tedious tie. Freed from the mule, here may his sufferings end. May prudence guide him, liberty attend. Freed from the weight of his mule, the preacher can now continue his walk unfettered and exploit the next mule as he pleases. Now, this pattern almost seems prophetic in that Eliza would meet just such an exploitative preacher and become one of his mules in a mere 5 years' time from this pattern being conceived. Now, Eliza often marked the passage of time by writing a pattern recalling the events of the previous year. And 1830, in many ways, was an ugly year for American history when we consider how settlers had treated Native Americans. Eliza was on the side of those lives that were destroyed by atrocities. She wasn't the only progressive alive at the time, of course, but she did join in the progressive humanist voices, which benefited from but lamented the passage of killing thousands for the purpose of European colonialism. The year gone by. In spite of all the watchfulness of interest multitudes, in spite of all the pictured bliss which fancy's liberal hand intrudes, advancing onward day by day as light aerial coursers fly, the hasty year has rolled away with hurried motion. Why? It hurried on to hide its guilty head, by mingling with the blood-stained years that lie in huddled heaps beyond the flood. It fled, afraid to wait the test of scrutiny. What was its crime? Its reckless hand was raised to tear from freedom's wreath the holiest gem. It aimed to have humanity displaced and bind oppression on her diadem. The year is gone, but hark! A sound is heard along the southern sky. An evil spirit lurks around, ghost of the year gone by. Beware, foul shade, a time will come when all the dead must reappear. Then justice will award the doom of each departed year. 185 years later, we're still waiting for the dead to reappear and award doom with justice for what was done to the Native Americans. Where Eliza really shined was in her ability to give voice to those without a voice. Many of her patterns gave words to emotions which often words simply didn't apply to. The first of these was titled The Widowed Mother, which is exactly what the title describes. And it's titled Inscribed to Miss Blank. Her bosom heaved a deeper sigh. Her bitter tears in torrents fell. Her babe was sleeping on her arms, nor felt nor feared, but all was well. The secret bitterness she felt, whene'er her sorrows grew so wild, none knew save he to whom she knelt to ask protection for her child. I've known, she said, a mother's joy. I felt a mother's tenderness. Mine is a widowed mother's grief. My little babe is fatherless. The looks of this cold-hearted world I have not courage to endure, but oh, it rends my bleeding heart to think my babe is insecure. Weak as defenseless woman is, I never felt unsafe before. Who will protect thy innocence, my babe? Thy father is no more. But there is one with piteous ear who feeds the ravens when they cry. He'll succor thee, oh never fear, thou hast a friend that will not die. Then suffer not thy mother's grief to interrupt thy sweet repose. To him whose eye commands relief, I should surrender all my woes. Then with an aspect which expressed a troubled heart half reconciled, she clasped her infant to her breast and said, My father, bless my child. This was the first of many patterns that Eliza Snow wrote to give voice to the voiceless. Women's voices simply didn't carry the social weight and value that men's did. We've come a long way, but it's important to recognize where we've been. And I'm going to allow Laurel Ulrich to illustrate my point better than I ever could. Quote, one scholar has estimated that in Mormon archives, men's diaries and memoirs outnumber those of women by 10 to 1. That may actually underestimate the problem. Although limited education may have contributed to the scarcity of women's writing, a more important factor was the cultural assumption that their words, like their duties, were essentially private and therefore beyond the reach of history. Men, not women, routinely served missions, and diary keeping was a missionary duty. Missionaries commonly wrote in bound journals. In contrast, female diarists often used the blank pages of other people's diaries, homemade packets stitched together from folded paper, children's school books, and in one case, the back of old maps. In archives, their words often fade into the page as though they had been exposed to rain, sun, and sleet, if not a laundry tub. Some pages are overlaid with the scribblings of children. Eliza R. Snow, Zina D.H. Young, and Bathsheba Smith were prominent leaders in 19th century Utah, yet their personal journals, like the 14th Ward quilt, almost disappeared. End quote. So it's not just that women had less access to education to learn how to read and write, but they rarely had the materials needed to capture their voice, instead relying on random scraps of paper that they could piece together from other sources. If they did have access to expensive paper to keep a journal, it was counter to societal norms for them to keep a journal because journal keeping was more often a man's task. If they did overcome these societal norms, rarely were these journals ever preserved as well as men's, because these women's voices, as Ulrich articulates so perfectly, were a private matter, culturally speaking. So if they weren't a private matter, women didn't have a say in what happened in society. So what could their journals possibly hold that was of any consequence, right? That's the cultural idea that makes it their voices so hard to capture. So when I say that Eliza Snow's patterns gave voice to the voiceless, it's because her poems offer a brief contemporary snapshot written from a woman's perspective, often concerning the plight of women's life at the time. Often these contemporary poems convey a sense of day-to-day life better than any late reminiscence, a memoir, or a biographical sketch ever could. Eliza's commentary on politics and world events is quite remarkable as well. You see, women's voices were not only ignored but actively suppressed when it came to political or national affairs. Men ran politics, and therefore only men's voices counted when it came to social commentary. However, a poet like Eliza could carefully craft her words, and people would buy the Ohio Star or whatever paper to learn her political commentary because she had a poem published in it. Now, I'd be willing to bet that the majority of Eliza's faithful audience were women who were interested in her astute take on society and politics. As evidence of this, many of her poems are written to women with titles like To Miss Blank or Forget Me Not, my epitaph to a ... So anonymized, but also written directly to members of her audience. She wrote her patterns for all to read, using inspiration from her friends and likely conversations she had with her friends concerning what was going on in the world around them. Sometimes Eliza became emboldened in her columns as more people bought the paper just for her poetry. Her razor-sharp commentary would, from time to time, make a precision strike at a man in high society when he was deaf to his own political suicide, and she relished the future when this politician was dead. Poem number 34, To a Politician. Pray when thou prayest that fame will spread a bright Parnassian wreath for thee. How well it twines around thy head, all but thyself may see. Crave what thou wilt, but surely crave a name, nor think the purchase dear, of sweetly sounded o'er thy grave, all but thyself can hear. Oh, scruple not yourself to sell, for what a generous world will give. Yes, let a grateful public tell when such an one did live. That was published in the Ohio Star in November of 1831. And Eliza published many poems about politics, about the plight of the Native Americans, about women, but she also published many poems about her own personal God. Now, this personal God was, of course, the Christian God, because she was living in 19th century America. But of course, she lamented how much this God had been co-opted and corrupted by priests seeking personal wealth and gain. Her own God was benevolent and egalitarian. And what I find interesting is not just her social commentary and giving voice to the voiceless, as you know, these were the outward expressions of her patterns, but the more internal nature that her poetry reveals. And what I mean by that is, like, while most Mormon women, from which we do have a small number of writings, they're dynamic and they're fascinating characters to learn about and learn from, few of these women have a character development story the way that Eliza's poems illustrate. Eliza is so dynamic when we read her first poems from the late 1820s and compare them with her timeline, joining Kirtland Mormonism to finally reading her Nauvoo poems in conjunction with her sparsely kept Nauvoo journal. Few women develop so much in such a tangible way to students of Mormon history. Then, of course, Utah Eliza Snow is a completely different person in so many ways. Kirtland and Nauvoo Eliza seems as if she was trying to find or trying to establish her place in Mormon society in the shadow of her sister wife and friend, Emma Smith. Utah Eliza, however, found that place and made it her own, and she thrived and became the most powerful woman in Utah history, even to this day. One of Eliza's longest patterns was composed in October of 1838, and it's titled The Gathering of the Saints and the Commencement of the City of Adam-on-Diamond. Now, her poems throughout her time joining the church make a shift to more religion and belief in God of the Old and New Testaments. And from 1838 on, they tend to focus more heavily on a construction of a literal Zion, a Mormon theocracy. And in many ways, Eliza would become paramount to establishing the Utah Mormon theocracy, and her poems throughout 1837 to 1844 reveal that she was the right person for the job with the right theocratic mentality. Here's a small excerpt from the Adam-on-Diamond poem. The God who talked with Adam face to face is speaking now in these latter days, and all the righteous men that ever stood upon the earth before and since the flood unite their faith to roll the kingdom forth until the little stone shall fill the earth. Joseph's and Judah's records joined in one, a powerful instrument have now become to gather up the saints, a noble band that will possess the consecrated land. From northern, eastern, and from southern climes, the camp of God comes up from time to time. Though different customs have their manners formed, though various feelings have their bosoms warmed, with one accord they hear the joyful sound, and to Messiah's standard gather round. Through stranger lands they trace a tedious road, to places chosen for the saints' abode, beyond the Mississippi's lucid flow, where Zion's towers will yet with splendor grow. For God has set his hand the second time to gather his dispersed from every clime. In Jackson County first they purchased land, where earth's metropolis in time will stand. On that choice soil, obtaining legal right, their hearts exulted with intense delight. But lo, as yet, the saints could not be blessed with the possession of eternal rest. And thus from time to time were driven forth to seek for shelter further to the north, where they are building cities to the Lord, that Zion in her strength may be prepared, ere the destroying angel ushers forth, and desolation's bosom sweeps the earth, ere the broad scourge by heaven's inflicting hand shall scatter terror through Columbia's land. So we can see a transformation in her poems. She went from this non-denominational, magic-believing Christian to a die-hard theocratic Zionist with the full expectation that she was part of the kingdom of God on earth. She went from believing in the Bible to believing the second coming was to happen in her own lifetime, and that the Mormons were responsible for building the kingdom. And Eliza's development from Christian to apocalyptic millennialist, helping to construct this literal kingdom of God, provides a fascinating window into the minds of many Mormon converts of the day. Now, the theology of Mormonism may have been, somewhat radical and unique, but the idea of America being the promised land, which Jesus will return to and reign from upon his second coming, that was by no means a new idea. Mormonism just happened to be led by a guy who was hell-bent on actually making that happen. Eliza's patterns continue to evolve as she moves to Quincy with the Mormon exodus from Missouri to Illinois. Her next poem was more written to the good citizens of Illinois who welcomed the religious refugees with open arms than it was to the Mormons who were moving there to begin with, as part of the Exodus. But the number of poems that she wrote in 1839 immediately in the wake of this Exodus, outnumbers the number of poems that she wrote for the 5 years previous almost by twofold. Now, one of these poems is quite interesting because it was basically a love letter to an unknown person that Eliza found attractive by deeming them Narcissus, after the Greek hunter who was known for his physical attractiveness. Maybe this person was Joseph Smith. Maybe it was somebody else who had stolen her heart, but we'll probably never know. This is titled Narcissa to Narcissus. And quick note, her very first poems that she ever published were under the pen name of Narcissa. So this is Narcissa to Narcissus. Deaf was my ear, my heart was cold, my feelings could not move. For all thy vows so gently told, thy sympathies of love. But when I saw thee wipe the tear from sorrow's fading eye, and stoop the friendless heart to cheer, and still the rising sigh, and when I saw thee turn away from folly's glittering crown, to deck thee with the pearls that lay on wisdom's fallow ground, and when I saw thy soul refuse the flattering baits of vice, and with undaunted courage choose fair virtue's golden prize, and when I saw thy towering soul rise on devotion's wings, and saw amid thy pulses roll a scorn of little things, I loved thee then for virtue's sake, and 'twas no crime to part with all that wealth bestows to make the purchase of thy heart. That was published in August of 1839 in the Quincy Whig. Soon after this poem, Eliza wrote a pattern to her brother, Lorenzo Snow, who was about to embark on a mission to European countries with the other apostles in the quorum. Like purling streams the fleeting moments rolled, or like the music of a dream untold, yet deep on memory's mirror lie impressed those blissful seasons which your presence blessed, when thou shalt move beneath a distant sky, and lengthening distance shall between us lie. Say, wilt thou, no, thou can never forget the time we parted and the time we met. Eliza's poems continue to chronicle her life when we read between the lines. At face value, her poems are interesting, but they're not particularly remarkable or, literarily striking. However, when we consider what was going on in her life, the population of women to which she gave a voice and what her future held unbeknownst to her when she was writing these poems, the poems are truly remarkable. By 1844, Eliza's published poems numbered in the hundreds, with hundreds of short stanzas throughout her personal journals and placed delicately into letter correspondences that she shared. Many of her published poems in the times and seasons were written as voices of warning to her sister wives, like this little note to Eliza Partridge, who was then just 18 years old, an orphan, and confused at the situation in which she found herself with the unconventional agreement among herself, Eliza Partridge, Emma Smith, and the prophet while she was living in their home. So this is titled, "You Know, Dear Girl, That God Is Just," and it's written in brackets, Eliza Partridge. So this is directly written to Eliza Partridge from Eliza Snow. You know, dear girl, that God is just. He wields almighty power. Fear not his faithfulness to trust in the most trying hour. Though darkness like the shades of night should gather round your way, the Lord our God will give you light if you his will obey. In sweet submission humbly wait and see his purpose crowned. He then will make the crooked straight and spread salvation round. Our heavenly Father knows the best what way we must be tried. Stand still and his salvation test. Thou shalt be satisfied. A little voice of warning to Eliza Partridge. Other patterns devised by Eliza Snow were directed to mourning mothers who had just lost their children or to fellow saints who were mourning other lost loved ones. Yet all the while, even other poems spoke to the political aspirations of the Mormon Empire. Now, these poems specifically I find to be fascinating because, once again, women had no place in politics of the day. Eliza, however, circumvented that cultural prohibition through the surgical knife of her poetry. Once again, her progressive social proclivities reveal themselves in this specific pattern, titled Riots in Congress. Hush, hush, lest the monarchs of Europe hear the heart-sickening sound that salutes the ear. For wherefore should haughty tyrants know that republican dignity's sinking low? Oh, where have the noble spirits gone? Oh, where is the glory of our fathers won? And where are the sages that used to feel for the nation's honor, the nation's weal? What? Riots in Congress? Can it be? In a country renowned for its liberty? That the highest department of state are rife with low-minded jargon and boyish strife. When the head is sick, the whole heart is faint, and a spreading disease must produce complaint. There's no wonder then at the public tone. The head is disordered, the people groan. Ah, riots in Congress, is it not? On our nation's escutcheon a deep foul blot? Yes, the standard of freedom has been disgraced, with a stain that can never be erased. Is there who will attend to the people's cause? Is there who will administer rights and laws? Men are fooling in Congress while free men roam in their own native country, thrust from home. Now we've riots in Congress, not only there, but riots are spreading everywhere. And the Union soon will be made to known that her sanction of mobbing has brought her low. Oh, where have the shades of our fathers gone? Oh, where is the spirit of Washington? Is this the proud climax of liberty? Are these the best blessings of being free? It's truly remarkable that women's political speech was often reduced to what poem they could get to be published in a paper. And yet, through all of this, the most remarkable of Eliza's poems was addressed to Queen Victoria, when Lorenzo Snow met her and Prince Albert in late 1843 and presented them both with Books of Mormon. This was just titled Queen Victoria. Of all the monarchs of the earth that wear the robes of royalty, she has inherited by birth the broadest wreath of majesty. From her wide territorial wing the sun does not withdraw its light, while earth's diurnal motions bring to other nations day and night. All earthly thrones are tottering things where lights and shadows intervene, and regal honor often brings the scaffold or the guillotine. But still her scepter is approved. All nations deck the wreath she wears, yet like the youth whom Jesus loved, one thing is lacking even there. But lo, a prize possessing more of worth than gems with honor rife, a herald of salvation bore to her the words of endless life. That gift, however fools deride, is worthy of her royal care. She'd better lay her crown aside than spurn the light reflected there. That's the Book of Mormon, of course. Or would she now her influence bend, the influence of royalty, Messiah's kingdom to extend and Zion's nursing mother be? Thus with the glory of her name inscribed on Zion's lofty spire, she'd win a wreath of endless fame to last when other wreaths expire. Though over millions called to reign, herself a powerful nation's boast, 'twould be her everlasting gain to serve the King, the Lord of hosts. For there are crowns and thrones on high, and kingdoms there to be conferred. Their honors wait that never die. There fame's immortal trump is heard. Truth echoes, 'tis Jehovah's word. Let kings and queens and princes hear. In distant isles the sound is heard. Ye heavens rejoice, O earth give ear. The time is now at hand to give a glorious period birth. The Son of God will take command and rule the nations of the earth. Conquering the world and building a Mormon empire, that wasn't some secret aspiration of Joseph Smith that he only told to people behind closed doors. It was the dream of every faithful Mormon living under his tyrannical reign. Now, granted, Eliza Snow was privy to all sorts of conversations with her husband that we'll never know and that no document ever contained. But the sentiments that he communicated to her personally and proclaimed to the Mormon community publicly soon became the sentiments and aspirations of every Mormon in the world at the time. They wanted to do whatever necessary to build the kingdom of God on earth, even if that meant forming an alliance with the greatest political enemy of the early American Republic to establish Mormonism as a state church of the United Kingdom by converting His and Her Highness to the truth contained in the Book of Mormon. This would be like Sherry Du today meeting with President Xi Jinping with hopes that he declares Mormonism as the national religion of China. Or this would be like the church building a temple in Moscow, hoping to convert Russians and take in millions in tithing from oligarchs. In and of itself, the motivation which led to Books of Mormon being given to the most powerful people in the world in 1843, it was downright treasonous. But because this is politics masquerading as religion, all of it goes completely unnoticed and nobody pays attention. Patterns of early Mormonism certainly make their way into headlines today, but I digress. One final word from Eliza R. Snow's lexicon to kind of round out our show today. And I know this really hasn't been a conventional show, so I really appreciate you sticking around through it. This is titled, The Past Year. A year. What is a year? 'Tis but a link in the grand chain of time extending from the earth's formation to the period when an angel standing in the sun shall swear, the chain is finished, time shall be no more. Then by the power of faith, that power by which the great Jehovah spake, and it was done, and nature moved subservient to his will, earth leaves the orbit where her days and nights, and years and ages have been measured long, by revolutions fixed, unchanging laws, and upward journeys to her native home. Where is the year? Enveloped in the past, with all its scenes and all its sceneries upon its bosom laid, the year has gone, to join in fellowship with all the years before and since the flood, leaving behind a train of consequences, those effects which, like a fond paternal legacy that firmly binds with interest kin to kin, unite the future, present, and the past. The year is gone. None but omnipotence can weigh it in the balance and define the good and evil mingled in its form. None but an omnipresent eye can view the foundations and the springs of joy and grief, of pain and pleasure, which within its course it opened and has caused to flow throughout the broad variety of human life. None else is able to explore the length and breadth, to fathom the abysses, and to pry into the cloistered avenues of this life's sceneries, and testify or count the seeds of bitterness which yield poisonous effluvia, proving, when infused into society, its deadliest curse, or number the bright rays of happiness, whether in sunbeams written or defined, by those soft pencilings of light, whose want of dazzling brilliance is more compensated by their constancy in everyday attendance, little joys, which shed a soothing influence on the heart, yet imperceptibly, by habit made to seem more like appendages than gifts bestowed, but who, with common sense and eye unclosed, with sensibility enough to keep the heart alive, with warmth enough to give an elasticity to half its strings, but finds inscribed upon the tablet of the memory a reminiscence of the year departed, deeply written there in characters that stand in bold relief. And more especially in these last days, when nature, seeming conscious that her time of dissolution is approaching, hastes with all the rude impetuosity of the tumultuous hurricane to close her labors. Every spirit is aroused, both good and bad, each to its handy work, diffusing in the walks of social life their honey and their gall. Each heart imbibes that which is most congenial to its own inherent qualities of character, of which a full development is wrought. By the effective hand of circumstance, a few more years of hurried scenery will tell the tale, the present drama close, decide the destiny of multitudes, and bring this generation to the point where time, extending to its utmost bound, will tread at the threshold of eternity. Indeed, it had been quite a year. You know, I read a lot of Eliza's poems while writing this script today, and, you know, the script was just a small sampling of hundreds within her published lexicon. You'll, of course, find a link to her lexicon in the show notes today if you want to read for yourself, because there really are some gems in there that I didn't include in the show today. But truly, the most remarkable thing about Eliza's poems is the evolution of her character and personality as she got older, wiser, and became more powerful in the church. If you read her earliest poems next to some of her later Utah-era poems, she's a completely different person. And really, few individuals that we study in Mormon history can we actually see such character development over such a long period of time. Few individuals were so integral to the evolution of the religion throughout so many different eras. Eliza joined the church when it was a campy kind of hippie cult in Kirtland. She witnessed the evolution of the church into a land and bank speculation endeavor, into a military command, and finally into a criminal empire with its own set of laws on the Mississippi. From that time forward, she saw the hardships over the overland trail migration, and she even kept her own trail journal. She saw the trials and tribulations of the Mormons settling in a hostile and alien desert to truly, once and for all, build their theocracy. She read newspaper reports on the Civil War. She defended polygamy. She founded the Utah Relief Society, as she was the most powerful woman that Bloody Brigham could trust to carry out his designs. Eliza R. Snow's life, chronicled, is one of the most incredible stories in Mormon history. And she's one of the only women in Mormon history to have an entire biography dedicated to just her, written by Maureen Ursenbach Beecher, who also published Eliza's journals that did survive. And just to sit back and think on this, like, such a dynamic figure of history. And, in many ways, I kind of thought, what better way to get to know Eliza Snow than by consuming her own artistic expression, which tapped deep into the foundations of who she was as a person. There is a trade-off, though, right? Which makes her story and the surviving documentation from her even more remarkable. Each and every person in Mormon history is just as unique and dynamic as Eliza was in real life. But because so few of them made the contributions to the cause that Eliza did, their writings and their personal achievements have faded away with the passage of time, and they're all but forgotten. We are lucky when it comes to Eliza R. Snow and everything that she left behind, but more importantly, her voice was valued in the early Mormon communities, and therefore her work and her personal writings were preserved for later generations. What we can learn from her, the patterns she teaches us about herself and by and large people in general, cause us to reflect on the people who experienced early Mormonism as more than just names and dates. They were real people with real struggles, real pains, real joys, real hardships, and real accomplishments. These people were just as real as you and me. Mormon history is the history of a people, not just a religion. With that, we're going to let Eliza take us out from one of her later poems written in Utah just a few years before she essentially retired and took on emeritus status as the president of the Utah Relief Society. This is titled, Our Former Loved Associates. Go ahead and dress this one up, Brian. Our former loved associates have mostly passed away, while those we knew as children are crowned with locks of gray. We saw time's varied trances were deep on every hand, indeed upon the people more marked than on the land. The hands that once with firmness could grasp the axe and the blade now move with trembling motion by strength of nerve decayed. The change in form and feature and furrow on the cheek of time's increasing volume in plain round numbers speak. And thus, as in a mirror's reflection we were told, with stereotyped impressions, the fact of growing old. Thank you, Eliza. Hey there, listeners. Do you like to be insulted? Do you like to give your money away? Well, if neither of those sound like appealing propositions, I want to let you know about a fundraising drive that is going on the Cognitive Dissonance and the Scathing Atheist podcast. They're friends of the show. We got Tom Cecil and, of course, Eli, Heath, and Noah doing their Vulgarity for Charity annual fundraising drive. Now, what they are doing is they are raising money for an organization called Modest Needs. Now, Modest Needs is basically a site where people can go and sign up and say, I have a very simple thing that a bill that came up, an unexpected bill that I need to help get paid so that I do not slip below into the cycle of poverty, right? And most people living here in America, they're, one or two unexpected bills away from falling into a horrible and vicious cycle of never recovering out of debt and into deeper and deeper poverty. Well, Modest Needs tries to rescue people right on the edge of slipping into those, whether they have an unexpected car repair or an unexpected bill came up or something to that effect. The kid gets sick, something to that effect. Modest Needs is there to be a safety net for those people who need help. Last year, the Scathing Atheist and Cognitive Dissonance guys on their Vulgarity for Charity fundraiser raised over $100,000. I mean, really close to $850,000 for Modest Needs during their Vulgarity for Charity drive. So what you do is you sign up on modestneeds.com. You look up some of the things that need, some of the people who need some level of donation, and you give them up to $50 or anything above $50, and that gets you entrance into being insulted on Cognitive Dissonance or on Scathing Atheist. And of course, if you want to pledge more than $50, if you want to give more than $50, that just means that you're a better person than people who just give barely enough to get insulted on the show. And then you send your receipt to Vulgarity for Charity. That's FOR, not the number, Vulgarity for Charity at gmail.com, and let them know that you did support one of these causes, that you did help somebody, escape from the clutches of the poverty cycle. And then on an upcoming episode of Cognitive Dissonance or Scathing Atheist, you get roasted for fun, and it's for insults for charity. And it's a really fun charity drive that they've been doing now for, I believe, the past 3 years. They've raised a ton of money for a really good organization and for really good causes. And this money is going to people who are in desperate need of it to escape from falling deeper into that poverty cycle. So if you want to do that, go to modestneeds.org and support one of those. And then once again, send in your receipt of $50 or more to vulgarityforcharity at gmail.com. With that, let's all go ahead and thank our newest patron over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. These are the good folks who support this show, this podcast. Our newest patron is Will M. That we also had a couple of pledge deletions, so we are down $6 from last week's episode. But if you want to help fill in that gap, or if you want to help support the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, don't. Go give your money to Modest Needs and then send your receipt into vulgarityforcharity at gmail.com. Help out, see if the people over at the Puzzle in a Thunderstorm crew and Cognitive Dissonance crew, see if they can get their full match. They have somebody who's pledged to match up to $100,000, so they could possibly raise as much as $200,000 for charity this year. It would be really awesome to help them out. So don't support this show. Go support Modest Needs. Go support the fundraiser that they're doing until Thanksgiving. So you still got a little bit of time from when this episode airs. We do have a little listener mail that I wanted to speak to really quickly. This came in from Williams. And William says, I've been a listener of your podcast for a few months now and find the story fascinating. He says he did not grow up in the church. I'm a Marxist atheist, but have always had an interest in the unusual history. And then to the question, Williams asks, do you have any history books, a book list for skeptics to use? I've tried looking online, but the reviews have nothing to do with the historicity of the material, but how it affects the church. Any help would be greatly appreciated and might help me with learning more. So I actually don't have a books list that I have compiled. I just have the books that I have used and the books that have been recommended to me by people within the Mormon history community, which is one of the main reasons why I go to Mormon history conferences like Sunstone Mormon History Association and John Whitmer, is to talk to people, hear what the newest reviews are on the newest history books, pay attention to the book review and the book awards that are given by each of these organizations every year. And that's how you find out what the best historicity, or the best books and biographies are as far as historicity goes. If you're wanting a good skeptical take on early Mormon history, No Man Knows My History is a really good place to start. It's wonderfully written. Fawn Brody, her style and her way with words are truly incredible, even though the book itself is quite dated, being from the 1940s. Much more modern take, I would recommend The Rise of Mormonism. That's written by H. Michael Marquardt. He's a fellow skeptic. He's somebody who has a very unabashed approach to church history, and he doesn't treat sources negatively or positively. He just deals with the sources the way that historians are supposed to. There are plenty of believing resources out there that are published by the church. Rough Stone Rolling even wasn't published by the church, but it is a biography of Joseph Smith. that attempts to deal with some issues that the church has never dealt with before. And, in by and large, the book is all right. It could have gone a lot further, but of course it was a very conservative book when it was published. And to this day, it's still one of the best biographies that's been given the stamp of approval by the church. So as far as historicity goes, those are three really, really good resources. There are other resources that if you're looking into specific aspects of Mormon history that are much more helpful. There are specific biographies. The biography about Sidney Rigdon by Richard Van Wagner is truly incredible. And that's just Sidney Rigdon's, the life and times of Sidney Rigdon is titled A Portrait of Religious Excess. If you're looking for, a biography on like Orrin Porter Rockwell. That's Man of God, Son of Thunder by Harold Schindler. That's another 1960s book, but it's truly incredible. If you're looking for the economic aspects of early Mormon history, you're looking for Robert Bruce Flanders' Kingdom on the Mississippi. That's the best book for Nauvoo history. If you're looking for polygamy, the history of Joseph Smith's polygamy, you're looking for In Sacred Loneliness, The Plural Wives of Joseph Smith by Todd Compton. There are a ton of really good resources out there. It just depends on what subject specifically you're looking into. And if Williams or if any listeners, if any of you are looking for a well-renowned book that is well agreed upon by the community for specific aspects of early Mormon history, then I'm always happy to recommend something more specific. And, the biographies and the historiographies of that early Mormon period era, there are way more books that are available than anybody could read in any reasonable amount of time. So there's a wealth of material to take from. So if you're looking for something more specific, of course, just reach out to me, nakedmormonism@gmail.com, the way that Williams did. And that's all the listener mail we have to get to today. And that's everything. That's going to wrap up our show. But of course, I want to thank all of you for tuning in and for hitting the download button. If you really enjoy the show, it would super help if you share the show with friends, with family members, if it's not going to scare them away, or if you share it on social media, or if you give us a good review on iTunes or Stitcher or whatever podcasting app you use. That helps a lot in the rankings, and when people are searching for Mormon stuff, Mormon-related podcasts, that really helps boost our search engine optimization, as Russell M. Nelson said at the 2 conferences ago. But if you're unable to do that, hey, you still hit the download button, you still hung in there until the end of the show, and for that, I want to thank you for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.